Mo Meaning Mondays number 6. I do this weekly series, if this is the first time you're clicking on this, where I do a close reading of Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. By close reading, I mean I go page by page through the book, usually one page at a time per week. Again, depending on what's on the page. Sometimes he has diagrams and so forth. Right now, this is week number 6, and I'm on page number 6. I do weekly recaps of the previous pages, but I want to avoid being too repetitive. So for this week, I'm going to go over this pages 1, 2, and 3 very briefly. You can't start or understand Maps of Meaning without knowing the very first sentence. The world is a form for action and a place of objects, and a complete world view needs to incorporate both. Myth provides us with a form of action and gives the world meaning, and science provides us with a world of objects and sense data. So that's basically pages 1 or 2. And if you wanted to read exactly what's on that slide, of course you can freeze frame and read it. Or check out my previous Mo Meaning Mondays. So the recap of page 3, I mentioned soccer is not just a game because that came up in his Sam Harris debate. I think his third debate with him, or talk with him, where they were going over the antique chair and the glass of water that might have been Elton John's and so forth. So Jordan's point is that intersubjective values are real, just as objective properties are, quote, real. This is deeply rooted in our psyche, so we have meaning associated with objects, and it's intertwined with the sense data of the object. This has slowly been stripped. I think this is the next one. This has slowly been stripped away from us so that our modern minds tend to perceive sense data and meaning as separate things. But children will perceive sense data and meaning singly as one, and ancient people, or people hundreds of years ago, also perceive things as one. So now on page 4, I'll read this a little bit more detailed. The medieval mind was contaminated with meaning. Myth and sense data were tangled together as one in objects. It's also interesting to note how tangled up politics and religion were at the time. Much of the religious warfare, quote unquote, was also very much political warfare. So you can attribute all the horrors of those wars as much to politics as you can religion, if you're going to be fair-minded about it. The universe was moral back in the medieval mind. It strove for perfection. This kind of reminds me of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic movement of the heavenly spheres. Now, this was not on page 4, but this is kind of what it reminded me of. And I think this was a Greek sense of truth that the medieval mind was trying to incorporate into Christianity, and they were trying to figure out how to do that. Matter itself had a telos. I think this whole Greek notion of truth is going to come up in the 6th page that we're going to do this week. The alchemists strove to find this telos in matter, this purpose, to find what makes matter perfect, to in turn find a way or the way, which they ultimately found to be in Jesus Christ. This was eventually, as I said, realized to be Jesus Christ after hundreds of years of psychological experimentation. And last week, I think I brought up, or was it the week before, the book by one of Jung's students, Alchemical Active Imagination, by von Franz. That's a very interesting look at the psychological aspects of the alchemists, and she uses one named Dorn as one of the most clear and famous alchemists to portray exactly what the alchemists were doing psychologically speaking. And he wasn't even aware of psychology as we know it. It was not something that they were aware of. So a recap of page 5. So this is from last week. So that loss of our mythic pre-experimental mind, the one that has meaning and sense data intertwined, has left our increased technological power ever more dangerously at the mercy of our still unconscious systems of valuation. And so this, I said, was as he says in the preface, the reason for his struggle with this book and his reason for kind of going after this problem, because we are too technologically sophisticated to lack wisdom, and our wisdom has to grow with our technological expertise and prowess in order that we survive as a species. And so, of course, during the Cold War, the fear for Jordan and many is that we would annihilate ourselves with using our nuclear weapons. And, who knows? That, of course, still is a possibility, but it's not as much of a possibility as it was before. And so Jordan had to figure out, why did people believe what they believed on both sides of this Cold War? Now, he says, we think. I thought that was very interesting. It reminds me of what Jung was talking about people who are not aware of their shadow side, the shadow side of themselves. They're obviously, it is exactly like it sounds, their evil side, the side that could be monstrous. And you'll hear Jordan talk about the Nazi regime and saying that when you think of the Nazis, you have to be aware of your own capability of becoming a Nazi, of becoming evil and acting out evil in the world. If you're not aware of that, then you lack proper defense mechanisms to keep that at bay. And so it's the unconscious monster that's the most dangerous. It's the person who says, I'm totally good, I would never be a Nazi, and so forth. They're the ones who can be very susceptible to becoming a Nazi because they're not on guard against it. Whereas the person who is very conscious and self-aware of their ability to do wrong can then set up some kind of defense against that. So he goes on to say, the pre-experimental mind believed religion as a matter of fact. I thought this was kind of interesting. I didn't quite touch on it last week the way I meant to. Or maybe it's just rereading it again that got me thinking of it in a slightly different way. So he says, the pre-experimental mind believed religion as a matter of fact. Modern minds have so much doubt, moral uncertainty, and are then susceptible to nihilism. Modern minds convince themselves, now this is me speaking here, this is how I started to think of it. The modern mind convinces themselves with their own sort of faith that their lives are worth living and meaningful. And this is going to tumble into, of course, as page goes into page, into this week's Mo Meaning Monday. It's kind of odd how, so in this time where we think of everybody being religious, everyone is having faith, he kind of writes it in as a matter of fact. Religion was just taken for granted. It was what everyone was doing. So, you would be the oddball if you weren't religious, if you didn't take what the priest said as a matter of fact. It wasn't one, as I believe he says exactly, it wasn't one of many theories or options you had. It was the option. And so it was your fact. And now I see, since he set that up as fact, then the fiction is what modern minds believe. The fiction is that your life has meaning, and that it's worth living and so forth. That's where the modern mind, and those people like Sam Harris, they have to put their faith in this fiction, in their story that they're creating with science, and they often will use science as a scientism, as an answer for everything. And so I think it's interesting how Peterson kind of reverses the roles there, or the story, as it were, as that we're used to hearing. That faith was something a lot of people had long ago, and now people no longer have faith. But if you look at it this way, maybe they didn't have so much faith so long ago. It was more about fact for them, And maybe the people nowadays who think they have no faith have a certain kind of faith, a non-traditional faith perhaps, one that we're not used to calling faith, and certainly not faith that they are used to acknowledging and calling faith themselves. So by the end of page 5, I believe, he goes over this in the monk debate very well. We need a story to rally around as a civilization. And the Christian story is one that he's found, I believe, as a civilization shaping map of meaning that has done well over time. So, as he often says, the trains run on time here. The police come when they're called. Of course, there are corruptions in the hierarchy, but things generally work. You get water when you go to your tap. When you turn on the lights, they come on. These are miracles. If you look back historically and even contemporaneously in many parts of the world, running water and electricity is a miracle. Walking into Stop and Shop and seeing all the variety of fruits and vegetables and meats is a miracle. That's heaven on earth for people even 100 years ago. So the Christian story seems to work well over time, and it has developed in the West. And I'm going to go over more about how it developed in the West and why it particularly is the story of success. In one of my human accomplishment video series, I'm coming up to that. I think I have a couple of more installments to do. The Aristotelian principle is next, and then comes the Thomas Aquinas part. And it's in that one that I'm going to go over why the Western Christianity was the key for this success. And what's very interesting is how we kind of have a way of, you can't do an experiment with history, and that's how you can't have, history is not scientific, but you can look back and you can compare, you can try to extract variables and apply variables, right? And so you say, well, Christianity existed for 2,000 years and it existed in these regions for this amount of time. So why didn't we have a scientific revolution in 100 AD around Palestine or something like that? And so now you have to ask these questions and you have to come up with answers. And another interesting split that I'm going to bring up in the Thomas Aquinas video is the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church and then the Protestant Church. So you have these sort of three major fractioning of the church, and then three factions developing from that, and then of course sort of multiple hundreds, I think, fractioning in the Protestant Reformation, almost infinitely fracturing. Then if you take it's a Bible and a man reading the Bible as sort of what accounts for your faith and your religion, almost, so to speak. All right, back to this. So now we're on page 6, and so I'm going to read through this, and then I'm going to bring up some points that Jordan brings up, and then I think I'm going to hit the second half of the page and finish up some interesting points that I thought were there. And then I think I'm going to bring up something by Iain McGilchrist in The Master and His Emissary. It's something I already went over with my Jordan as if Peterson video, but I want to try to summarize it in like a minute or two instead of doing 10 minutes and reading it. I'm just going to try to summarize it for a minute because it's something that's going to come up again in my Peterson Paradox video and the second installment to that, and I need to be able to talk about it, and the more I talk about it, the better I get at talking about it. So bear with me as I practice. Okay, so Jordan says on page 6 of Maps of Meaning, man no longer occupies center stage. The world is, in consequence, a completely different place. So your belief and your beliefs sort of shape what the world is. And as the medieval mind fades and the modern experimental mind grows in ascendancy, the world looks like a different place. It is a completely different place. The mythological perspective has been overthrown by the empirical, or so it appears. This should mean that the morality predicated upon such myth should have disappeared as well, as belief in comfortable illusion vanished. Friedrich Nietzsche made this point clearly more than 100 years ago. When one gives up Christian belief, for example, one thereby deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Christianity is a system, a consistently thought out and complete view of things. If one breaks out of it a fundamental idea, the belief in God, one thereby breaks the whole thing to pieces. One has nothing of any consequence left in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man cannot know what is good for him and what evil. He believes in God, who alone knows. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendental. It is beyond all criticism, all right to criticize. It possesses truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with the belief in God. Now I'm just going to break in here. This is very interesting. And this is what I believe a lot of people struggle with, or they don't quite understand. And certainly Sam Harris brings it up a lot, and Matt Dillahunty. I used to do a lot of apologetics, and this is something that I also struggled with. And it's this idea, we're very used to the Greek idea of truth. And here what Nietzsche is describing is not the Greek idea, it is the Hebraic version of it. And it's what I talked about in that video I recently did of Jordan as if Peterson, where he says, I act as if God is true. And it's about belief and what belief means. And I'm going to get to that at the end of this video, or towards the end of this video. But this Hebraic version of truth, it's not that there is something that is true or good out there, and then because it is true or good, God approves of it because it's good. It is the will of God that makes something true or good. And this kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth if you are used to this Greek idea that everything has to be measured against some standard that is the good or the true or truth. And we measure ourselves in that standard, against that standard, and then we can tell who's good and who's bad, what's truth and what's not. And then what man tends to do next is he moves away from, he judges man, his own fellow man, but then he starts to judge God, and he starts to put that rule, that measure, up against God and says, aha, God is not good. Here's what he did. See, this is not good. This was awful. This was horrendous, and so forth. And so now he starts to make God into an immoral being and a deceiver. That's only because you're using a Greek measure or a Greek idea of truth. That's not the only conception of truth, and it's certainly not the conception of truth that we find in the Old Testament, and then birthing from that the New Testament. It still follows that that truth is something made by God. And as Nietzsche says, the whole thing rests on the belief in God. It stands or falls with the belief in God. And I'll continue reading. If modern Westerners really do believe they know of their own accord intuitively what is good and evil, if they consequently think they no longer have need of Christianity as a guarantee of morality, that is merely the consequence of the ascendancy of Christian evaluation and an expression of the strength and depth of this ascendancy. So that the origin of modern morality has been forgotten, so that the highly conditional nature of its right to exist is no longer felt. And this is what, this whole page, and this particularly, is what, again, Jordan was trying to drive home with Sam in their talks, and Sam just never engaged with this idea, or just denied it. He just denies it, and then, I don't know. Again, I agree with Paul Vanderklay that it was disappointing that Sam Harris wouldn't engage with Jordan in their talks. Especially over so many, you had so many hours and time in between to get feedback, but I guess it just couldn't happen at that point. So I think there's a lot of interesting things in here, and we're going to go from the mythological to the empirical. So Jordan says the mythological perspective is overthrown by the empirical, or so it appears. I like how he phrases that and how he says that, or so it appears. Because this is what people say. It's what you might read in a history class as the fact, right? As Sam says, the facts, right? But Jordan's looking at man, the psychology of man the animal, man from below and from above. But he's starting with the from below, and that is what engages people. That's what engages the scientific-minded modern people. It certainly is what engaged me to begin with. If it was so simple, then Sam Harris would be correct and there would be no discussion between Jordan and Sam, right? So if the mythological perspective was just simply overthrown by the empirical and everybody now had a scientific mind and acted out everything rationally, there wouldn't have to be this discussion. But there is a big discussion and there is a big debate here because it's not so simple. So Jordan brings up Nietzsche to make one of his points, I think partially, that the presuppositions of a theory matter, and Sam shares this, that the presupposition of God in Christianity allows for Christians to claim that morality, the Christian morality, that once that is abstracted into nothingness, and this is William Blake, all abstraction is subtraction, if you follow my Fearful Symmetry Fridays, then you can no longer lay hold of that morality while still being intellectually honest. And I think that last part is the key. He doesn't say these words intellectually honest, but that's the sense I'm getting from it. And that's what I thought he was trying to hold Sam accountable, saying you can't be intellectually honest if you're holding all of these Christian principles and then wiping away the presupposition, the Christian God. That's not intellectually honest. Even Nietzsche says this. And Nietzsche is long dead. He doesn't have a bone in this fight. Why don't you go back to that and look at it and wrestle with that, Sam Harris? And I think I don't know why Jordan just didn't bring up that quote, because he did have his laptop. He was ready. He was prepared, but I guess it never got to that point in the conversation. So I'm going to read the second half of the page and speak a little bit more about it. If the presuppositions of a theory have been invalidated, argues Nietzsche, then the theory has been invalidated. But in this case, the theory survives. The fundamental tenets of the Judeo-Christian moral tradition continue to govern every aspect of the actual individual behavior and basic values of the typical Westerner, even if he is atheistic and well-educated, even if his abstract notions and utterances appear iconoclastic. He neither kills nor steals, or if he does, he hides his actions, even from his own awareness, and he tends, in theory, to treat his neighbor as himself. The principles that govern his society, and increasingly all others, remain predicated on mythic notions of individual value, intrinsic right and responsibility, despite scientific evidence of causality and determinism in human motivation. Finally, in his mind, even when sporadically criminal, the victim of a crime still cries out to heaven for, quote, justice, and the conscious lawbreaker still deserves punishment for his or her actions. Our systems of post-experimental thought and our systems of motivation and action therefore coexist in paradoxical union. One is up-to-date, the other archaic. One is scientific, the other traditional, even superstitious. We have become atheistic in our description, but remain evidently religious, that is, moral, in our disposition. What we accept as true and how we act are no longer commensurate. We carry on as if our experience has meaning, as if our activities have transcendent value, but we are unable to justify this belief intellectually. We have become trapped by our own capacity for abstraction. It provides us with accurate descriptive information, but also undermines our belief in the utility and meaning of existence. This problem has frequently been regarded as tragic, it seems to me, at least ridiculous, and has been thoroughly explored in existential philosophy and literature. So that is the line that, of course, I couldn't capture on my picture. I really loved the way he wrote all of this, as some of the writing early on, and this is still very early on in the book, tended to be a little bit more tortured, because you could tell he was just starting, he was trying to figure out exactly every word and every sentence. This seems a little bit more smooth and easier to read, and I like the way it's phrased. So there's something that caught my eye as I was reading it just now. He says, okay, one is scientific, the other traditional, even superstitious. I don't see him talking about it being superstitious much these days. I'm not sure why he used that word here. Maybe it's something he's willing to grant, but that there's a non-negative meaning to that word, of course. It could be technically understood too. We've become atheistic in our description, but remain evidently religious. That is moral in our disposition, right? So we accept what we accept as true, and how we act are no longer commensurate. We have become trapped by our own capacity for abstraction. If I don't mention this, I forget what I wrote in these next slides, but so we have become trapped by our own capacity for abstraction. I think that's where I caught that, what I previously mentioned, that all abstraction is subtraction, and you can abstract things out into nothingness. And again, go back to my Fearful Symmetry Fridays, where I go over that book, Fearful Symmetry, and some of the beliefs that William Blake held and argued for. He might as well have been Jordan Peterson of his day, somewhat, and Northrop Frye kind of reaffirming these things and expanding on them. And of course, Northrop Frye being a professor at the University of Toronto, a generation or two before Jordan Peterson, and expounding on these things as a literary critic. And then here you have Jordan, who was influenced by Frye. He cites this book that Frye wrote, The Great Code, many times in Maps of Meaning. Yeah, so the idea of our becoming trapped by our own capacity for abstraction. So here's something that science loves. Science thrives on this capacity for abstraction to create a mathematical universe. If you want to read an interesting book by a physicist, Max Tegmark, Our Mathematical Universe. I have it right in front of me. My Quest for the Ultimate Nature of Reality. You'll get a basic science education in the first part of that, and then you'll get into his theory that everything is in reality, in actuality, everything in the universe, including us, is just a form of math. I forget the technical word for it. We're like a mathematical expression of some sort. So you have simple things, like a triangle is an expression of a mathematical formula, and a circle, and so these are like two-dimensional things, and then you can get into cubes, and then you can get into more and more complicated mathematics that go into higher and higher dimensions, and we are just part of that mathematical reality. It's not something, he's saying something that's very interesting to think about, but here's where his left hemisphere, as McGilchrist might say, and as Blake would say, his your reason, the God that is this God of mathematics and abstraction and measures, weights and measures, is finding only what he already knows. He knows math, and so he finds it everywhere. And the scientist builds a world off of abstractions, and that's all he can find is more he abstracts and abstracts until there's nothing left. So in my Fearful Symmetry Friday videos, I go over how there's a risk and danger in some certain conceptions of God that lend themselves to this endless abstraction and that lead to science, which is a good thing if it's a tool that's properly used, and this is what Jordan's getting at, that we have to properly use it, but can lead to the actual death of God, as Nietzsche announced, because we keep abstracting out until there's nothing, until it's an ad absurdum. It's nothing but the absurd. And what I think saves Christianity is getting away from that Greek sense of truth and that Greek sense of knowledge, and the Greek morality, and go back to the Hebraic version. And so that's one part. And then the other part, you're still not quite saved yet, but you certainly are most of the way there. I think the second very important part is the nature of Jesus Christ as the part of the Godhead, as the part of the Trinity. And this, of course, is very hard to conceptualize for strictly monotheistic faiths like the Jewish one and like Islam. And of course you may say, well, Christianity is also monotheistic, and I agree, but it's an interesting quirk in monotheism to have this God in human form and Jesus Christ, and still have God the Father and the Holy Spirit and so forth. I think that is some kind of brilliance that saves Christianity from being abstracted into nothing. But of course, it still depends on how you look at things. So anyway, so I kind of went off on a tangent there, but the theory survives. Okay, this is the paragraph that Jordan Peterson got into with Matt Dillahunty, famously calling him a Christian. Okay, so we may consciously cast off what those medievals thought, right? But subconsciously or unconsciously, as Jung might say, we are still acting it out. It's still deeply ingrained in our biological evolution, okay? And Jordan will famously point out, he'll go all the way back to lobsters. I think, does he go back to trees too? I'm not sure. Nietzsche points to trees fighting for the sunlight. And so this kind of upsets atheists. Certainly Matt Dillahunty got upset by this. And I just wonder, would it be more appropriate to just say cultural Christian instead of saying outright you're a Christian? I know there's a point to that. It's to get people's interest and attention and get them listening. But don't people normally just use the word cultural Christian? I'm not sure. Is that the person who just goes to church on Easter and Christmas and, is nominally Christian, whereas atheists are not even nominally Christian? They're just, they don't do any of that. But what if Jordan just said, well, I think you're a kind of cultural Christian in the sense that we have a culture, a civilization that's heavily shaped by Christianity, and you are living in that realm and of that shape and of that being. Anyway, I thought that might be an interesting way of saying it that doesn't rile someone up to a defensive position so much so that they're all defensive and they're not listening anymore. And so perhaps they would admit, yeah, I'm a cultural Christian. I kind of accept things that any of you Christians accept as moral, and I act just like any other Christian acts. I think I act well, whatever. So maybe they might not get so defensive by using that terminology, and then maybe they might listen to what he has to say a little better. Again, it's just something I'm thinking about. I'm not sure about it. So the mythic notions of individual value. I thought that was an interesting way of putting it. And the intrinsic right and responsibility. Mythic notions. That this is something he's arguing about with Sam Harris. This is not something that's obvious and objective. I'm going to do a video review. Sometimes I review movies just from the psychological, philosophical, Jordan Peterson perspective. And one of the movies I want to review coming up, since we're getting into this Halloween month, is Bone Tomahawk. It's not a very well-known movie, It had a 1.3, I think, or $1.6 million budget. I think Kurt Russell's in it, some other people. Really horrendous, horrific movie. And it's a very good movie as a film, I think. But it is filled with just the most graphic violence and horror that you can put on film. And what I'm going to try to get across in my review is that it shows us that civilized people in general, don't have to be civilized the way we think they do. And this may seem obvious to people who are Jordan Peterson fans and who are listening to this video, but it's not so obvious to Sam Harris, even though he is arguing heavily against a whole other civilization, that of the Muslim world. This is a whole other civilization that holds different beliefs and values. This is another way that they've come to live, and he's arguing against it, or certain aspects of it, I guess. But it doesn't have to be. Like the way that he develops his ethos in a Christian society is not the way man is necessarily. It's how we are accidentally, given the luck of the draw that we ended up in the Christian West and so forth. Anyway, according to Nietzsche, he can't simply borrow bits and pieces that, quote, work in other systems. Firstly, as pointed out, he can't be intellectually honest and do this. That's just right off the bat. You're not being intellectually honest if you cast away the presuppositions that build up the system itself. It's like taking away the foundation and expecting the building to stand. So, secondly, he would have to know what is ethical to begin with. And then, once you know what is ethical, you go about the process of picking out that which is ethical from other systems. So when they say, well, we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, or we're going to keep the good stuff and, eject the bad, they don't know that unless they can't just figure it out as they're casting away this and that. You have to know it, what's ethical. So you just push the problem back a step by saying you're going to pick and choose what's good from other systems. You have to know to start with what's good and bad, to differentiate that in other systems. Anyway, so all of this, despite scientific evidence of causality and determinism. I thought that was an interesting sentence there, and I would like to see where he goes with that in the future of the book. He'll probably bring up studies and so forth, because he's saying it's scientific evidence. And I've heard him speak about this as far as free will and determinism is known in common parlance and culture and stuff. And I think he was talking about how you can, what was he saying? Something like the decision to drop your arm or catch a ball or something can be made, but there's some point in that process that once, you set the chain of reaction off, you're not going to be able to stop it. The signals can't be processed fast enough to stop it in a certain time frame and a certain space. So I think that's the way he's meaning it and expresses it. But again, I will have to look further on in the book to see. So the post-experimental thoughts and archaic beliefs. The paradoxical union this is what he says the paradoxical union is, our systems of post-experimental thought and our systems of motivation and action. And I think this is closing in on what I'm calling the Peterson paradox. It's an element of it. It's approaching the paradox. It's closer to it than we've previously come in the book. So I'm going to say that again. The paradoxical union is our systems of post-experimental thought and our systems of motivation and action. Our post-experimental thought is, quote, up to date. And this is what Brett Weinstein was sort of talking about with Jordan and Sam, this notion that it's up to date, like software, it's up to date, it's updated, and so forth. They kept using this phrase over and over again. Well, Jordan used it so many years ago when writing this book. Our systems of motivation and action are archaic. These are the things that are built into us evolutionarily speaking, and and they're very old. They're very old things. So the post-experimental is scientific. I want to keep that in mind. And the systems of motivation and action are what he says traditional or even superstitious. Now, I think I got into this a little bit already. The trouble he gets into here is when he makes these specific phrases. The way he says it may come off, I don't know, can be misinterpreted or come off saying one thing when he means another, or maybe he just means it the way it is. I'm not sure. But so this is where he gets into trouble with many atheists. And now he starts to appear to equate being moral, our moral disposition, with believing in God to some extent. We, quote, we have become atheistic in our description, but remain evidently religious, that is, moral in our disposition. So, people may say they don't believe in God, but the way they act says otherwise. They act morally, that's their disposition, is one that is religious from his perspective. It's something that can't be cast off just by mere words, by saying it. It's too complicated, it's too built in, and to reformulate everything would be too much work to really do. So, quote, we accept as true and how we act are no longer commensurate. What we accept as true and how we act are no longer commensurate. They cannot be held together because we're saying one thing and we're doing the old thing, right? We're saying we're new and modern, but we're living out the old traditional story. And just as a side note and a little personal note, I brought this up way back in one of my original videos. I think it's my fear of Jordan Peterson. I have a friend who's a very social justice warrior friend, and I sort of got him, I played a small role in getting him involved in church, and he became a pastor, a Lutheran pastor. And, I gave him Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship, and I could really see a turning point in his path, in his life path at that point. I got him into seminary, and he went to a very good seminary, and Union Seminary in New York City. Of course, it's very liberal. Liberation theology was, of course, taught to him and so forth. And he's the type of person who's very kind-hearted, very generous, very good. He has a very good character, this person, my friend. But he did not have a mind that was willing to fight for what he believed. I'm sure he acquiesced to whatever his professors were telling him. And of course, you're in, the social context you're in is one to acquiesce. I was more of the mind to argue with my professors vehemently if it came to something that I held dear in my belief system. I did not roll over when it came to what I thought was true in my belief structure. Anyway, so my friend, although he projects and he talks this very liberal, way of life, that there are a million genders, that God is genderless. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a Swedish church that says God is now genderless and they will not refer to he, him, or something like that. And of course I can understand that intellectually, but there's a reason why we were doing he's and hims to refer to God. And of course, Jesus is, God knows what they're saying. I don't actually know what they're saying about Jesus, but maybe they're saying he's non-binary. I could imagine it. Let's just say I could imagine they're saying Jesus is non-binary. And so while my friend says all this, he acts differently. The way he lives his life is very different from the extreme things that he's saying. He lives a very traditional life. He's married. He has children. He's a pastor of a church, for God's sake. But yet he will tell people how to live their lives in a completely different fashion, saying, well, there's no gender, there's no this, there's no that. Sort of breaking down all the rules, right? All the tradition is being scrapped. Yet he's living his life traditionally. It works good for him, right? It works well enough for him, but not for others, I guess. This is what rubs me bad with this particular friend. And ultimately, I cannot even stand talking to him because of what I see as almost like a double speak in 1984. I know this is getting a little bit personal, but maybe some of you can relate to this, that in the SJW crowds that Jordan Peterson deals with, there's almost like a double speak where we're going to project one thing, and then some of us, while projecting one thing, let's say the professors, they're living very traditional lives as professors at universities, very protected, very well paid, very cushy, but they're telling their students to all go live these extremes, radical ways, where all the rules are broken down. So they're sort of saying one thing and living another, right? What do we call that? That sounds like hypocrisy, right? It just screams hypocrisy to me. And of course, everybody gets irked when they find some kind of hypocrisy in their lives. Not to say I haven't been hypocritical in some of the things that I live out, but I examine that. I am self-critical of that, and I'm aware of that. It's these unaware, it's like what Jung says, the person who's unconscious of their shadow. It's what Jordan is facing, many people who deny that they have a shadow self altogether. You know, we are, as Christians, we admit we're sinners. We're aware of that. And the point is, we are aware of what Jung would say, our shadow self, and what Jordan's calling us to be aware of, that we could have been the guards at Auschwitz. That's the point. And I don't think that side realizes it. I'm kind of losing my voice now, but I'm going to try to keep going. Did I finish that slide? I don't even remember if I finished it. Okay, so trapped by... where was I? Yeah, so no intellectually justifiable belief in a meaningful life. So the modern mind can't really justify their beliefs in a meaningful life. Jordan says there's nothing, you can't intellectually justify that anymore, although Sam Harris tries. We're trapped by our own capacity for abstraction. Again, I mentioned this a couple of times. This provides an accurate descriptive, our capacity for abstraction provides us an accurate descriptive information of the world, and this is useful to science, but it undermines everything else. It undermines all the meaning that we used to have in the world. So tragedy or comedy, it depends on belief. And finally, this is where I'm going to mix in a little bit of Iain McGilchrist in his section on belief, which I believe was around page 170 of The Master and His Emissary. And Jordan says that much of this loss of meaning is regarded as tragic, but Jordan says, to him at least, it seems to be ridiculous, which I'm curious to read further and see if he expands upon that little side note there. And I'm saying it depends on belief. So the lens you're looking at, through which the lens you look, will depend upon how you view this as tragic or comedic. So right and responsibility. Jordan uses these words, that there's this mythic version of the individual, this belief in the individual, that they have intrinsic value, that they have rights and responsibilities. And notice Jordan puts rights as the other side of responsibility. He's not being ideological like he says the other side is, where they will just tell you, they will just emphasize one part of that, the rights part. Jordan's saying you can't emphasize one part and not the other. You have to have them both. They're two sides of a coin. So it's rights and responsibility. That's the root concept. This is where McGilchrist says it's the root concept. Responsibility is the root concept of which there is a calling and an answering. Again, I got into this a little, more. I expanded upon this. I read verbatim what McGilchrist wrote in my Jordan as if Peterson video, where he explains, I act as if God exists. This is my full explanation about that is in that video. But right here, I want to tie this in again. I want to try to explain it again. So responsibility is the root concept of which there is a calling and an answering, according to McGilchrist. This notion of belief is not a watered-down form of thinking laced with doubt. That's what the left hemisphere would have you think. And the reason why people think so much that way, according to McGilchrist, is because the left hemisphere has become so dominant. It's so ascended culturally. in the West, not so much in the East, which is something I'm going to talk about later on when I go over the Master and his Emissary in more detail. So the belief is a matter of care. It's a disposition towards the world, as McGilchrist says. This is a disposition towards the world, and a relationship, most of all, towards someone or something, but it's mostly towards a person. If one believes in another, this demands a behavior from you towards the other, and from the other towards you. This is the relationship that we find ourselves as believers in the Christian God. There is then established, quote, a reverberative, a resonant, and this is exactly how McGilchrist is spelling it, resonant, resonant, responsible relationship, in which each part is altered by the other and by the relationship between the two. So there exists a betweenness. McGilchrist is very big on emphasizing this betweenness in and among those who believe and that which is believed. There's a betweenness in and among those who believe and that which is believed. And this is where I think you're going to find this is the right spot between the chaos and the order. And this is very much what McGilchrist tried to establish with Jordan when he spoke to Jordan for that half-hour interview, because Jordan sounded very, very orderly. And Jordan explained he only sounds orderly because the problem is chaos right now. But ideally, you want to sit in the spot between order and chaos, having this disposition of care, this disposition of belief, where there's a betweenness established between personalities, and not just things, but personalities. So belief and truth. Truth is a disposition towards the world. Faith and belief form a sort of relationship between two personalities. The belief alters the world. This is from McGilchrist. The one in which there is a God, and it alters me. So if you believe in God, that belief alters the world, the one in which there is a God, and it alters you, the believer. You cannot have no disposition or no belief, for that is still a disposition towards the world. McGilchrist makes that point. Again, if you want to see any of this expanded upon, it's in my Jordan As If Peterson video, where he explains that why he acts as if there is a God. I think that's all I have for this week. And again, I will read this again. I usually do read it again, the full page, but I think I'm going to skip that this week because we went over this pretty thoroughly. I did hang on this section when I first read it in this video. That's that. All right. So again, if you are interested in maps of meaning or Jordan Peterson, or like these kind of close readings, or you've read this book a year ago and you're trying to remember what it says, you might like this series. I'm assuming some of you are clicking this and watching it for the first time. So please give this video a like, and if you have not subscribed already, please do so. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.